Hello and welcome back. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV. Welcome back to another weekly used gun review. Remember, in these videos, I take about 8 used firearms that have come into the store and give you guys about a 2 to 4 minute review of each, giving you guys an idea of some different stuff out there on the market. Remember, the point of this video is strictly to be entertaining and educational. We are not making this video to sell anything, to keep in accordance with YouTube's policies. Also, if you do come back and you regularly enjoy these videos, please go ahead and subscribe to this channel, hit that bell notification button so you are aware when we are posting these videos. Anyway, guys, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it now. Alright, this video is brought to you by our new website, WeBuyGuns.com. If you are considering selling a firearm or firearms collection, please consider logging onto our site and creating an account. From there, you can submit your firearms for an offer request. With that offer, you will get a printable offer certificate, which you can take with you to competing gun stores to try and leverage yourself a better deal. If you're unable to get a better deal, go ahead and sell it to us. We do provide you with a shipping label, and we will pay you with either a paper check or ACH direct deposit to make the process as easy for you as possible. Remember, please go check us out at WeBuyGuns.com. Now, getting into this, remember the format of the video is we start with most common and move through least common as the video progresses. Starting us off in our first spot here is a firearm that comes to us from a local seller, and this is a Lithgow No. Mark III Enfield, chambered in .303 with a 10-round capacity, of course. Now, most people equate the No. Mark III or Mark III Star pattern with the typical standard issue rifle issued by Britain primarily in the First World War. Now, as time would go on, throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, Britain would continue development off of this pattern, and eventually they would land on the No. 4 Mark I series, which was famously used in the Second World War by a lot of the Commonwealth countries. You saw use, of course, primarily through Britain. You saw Long Branch in Canada manufacturing the No. 4 Mark Is, as well as even Savage manufacturing them for Lend-Lease as well. But one country in particularly, and that was Australia, decided to maintain the original No. 1 Mark III or Mark III Star pattern for its use in the Second World War. Now, between 1939 and 1945, Lithgow Small Arms Manufacturing Company in Australia would produce about 500,000 No. 1 Mark IIIs, still keeping it a very relevant rifle if we look at World War II history. And actually, when it comes to Enfields, I personally have a little bit more interest in the No. 1 Mark III pattern. Even though I'm more of a World War II era collector, I've always just really liked the aesthetics of the No. 1 Mark III just a little bit more than the No. 4 Mark I, and I know I'm not alone there. The iconic sort of nose cap up here at the front and everything like that. Really popular, really robust rifle. Does cock on close, which gives it a very fast cycle, the potential to cycle the action very quickly. With a 10-round detachable box magazine, of course, it was meant to be loaded through the top with stripper clips. A really cool rifle. Now, of course, these would continue on through service in a lot of other countries, even past the Second World War, up through the 60s, 70s, and even 80s. And some countries are still using the No. 1 Mark III and No. 4 Mark I, and you can see that around the world in military service today. That's not exclusive to these, but a lot of World War II technology is actually still being used around the world today. So really cool rifles. If we look at the value on this sort of thing, pricing on these is all over the board. Now, this one particularly is non-match, and it does have a mismatched bolt, and the condition, I would say, is good-ish, maybe fair to good. So it's nice, serviceable condition, definitely would make a good shooter. Typically, the Lithgow Enfields in this condition, you will see anywhere between about $300 to $500, depending on, again, the condition, that sort of thing. Now, really good condition ones that are all matching, I've seen exceed upwards of about between $600 and $800 respectively, again, for really nice pristine matching conditions, which are a lot more collectible. But if you're looking for something like a shooter, something like this in this condition is a really good way to go and won't break the bank, and is also a good way to fill a hole in any type of World War II or Enfield collection. So Lithgow, I actually own one of these personally, a Lithgow manufacturer No. 1 Mark III. Really cool, fun, collectible rifles, and I'm really happy to get this in and share it with you guys, and thank you to our local seller for bringing this one into us. Okay, up next is a really cool pistol coming to us from a viewer in Georgia, so thank you so much for sending this one along to us. This is a CZ model, or VZ24, which is chambered in .380. It does have a detachable 8-round magazine. The barrel does rotate to lock, and it is single action. Now, this would actually be a later design iteration of the CZ22, the 1922 model, which itself was a license from Mauser, as it was very directly related to the Mauser model 1914. Now, a couple years later, they would come up with this pattern chambered in .380. About 1925, 1926, it would be officially folded into the Czechoslovakian, current-day Czech Republic military. This one actually has the J rampant lion and 26 acceptance marks. You'll probably see that when I do a slow pan of this pistol. Now, a couple years later, they would come up with a more revised model known as the Model 27, the CZ27, which was chambered in .32 automatic. And that's the one that gets a lot more press, as you tend to find those more with the German acceptance markings, as a lot of those were folded into German military service after the occupation of Czechoslovakia in the early days of the Second World War. Now, since most of these had been already produced and manufactured for the Czech military, you know, typically when you see Waffen amps or the German acceptance marks, that was after the occupation of the factory when they're being manufactured under German control. Those arms that had already been made oftentimes did not go back for acceptance marks and things like that. So if they did see German service, the earlier pre-occupation firearms might not show those markings, but that's not true in all cases, just it happens to be true in most cases. This is a very interesting one in particular. This one has 4 vertical serrations on the slide. Now, the Model 1924 was known for having serration cuts at a 45-degree angle. It was the 27 that had vertical cuts. I'm not too sure as to why that is. This is definitely a 24 slide. This is definitely a Model 24. I read some information online pertaining to that. You know, in the early 1940s, 41 to 42, there was a small production run of 24 models for the Luftwaffe, which had vertical cuts. I'm not sure if that's true or not. That's just something interesting. Now, this was also basically a conglomeration of parts. Slide is not numbered, barrel is mismatched to the frame. So again, it could have been manufactured from parts. I don't know why the manufacturing changes would have been made here. If you're watching and you're an expert on the Model 24, I would be interested to know. Anyway, really, really cool pistols. Ergonomic, really, really controllable in the hand. In fact, if I had a choice between a 24 and a 27, I would prefer the 24 if it were something that I were going to carry as a service sidearm. Pricing on these on the market is not too crazy. Most cases you find these in the $500 range-ish, plus or minus, depending on condition, matching parts, and things like that. So really, really cool collectible firearms for around the pre-war, the interwar period, having also seen service in the Second World War as well. So really happy to get that one in and share it with you guys. Okay, up next is a rifle that I am personally very fond of. This one comes to us from a local customer. What this is a Uberti manufactured copy of the Winchester 1873, imported by Cimarron Firearms. I'll talk about the 1873 and then we'll talk about Uberti. The 1873, the story with it would begin with Benjamin Tyler Henry in 1860 with the development of the Henry rifle. Now, that was the first magazine-fed lever-action repeating rifle of this variant. We're not talking about the Spencer carbine, which is similar. In this configuration that has evolved into what we really know and enjoy today, being manufactured by companies like Winchester, Marlin, modern-day Henry, you know, still in production today. So what you had there was a magazine tab follower. There was no handguard here. You have a tab that comes along the bottom of the magazine tube. You bring it up to the front, you open up the magazine tube and the barrel will pivot. You drop your rounds in, you drop the follower, and the follower will chase the rounds down as you're feeding them. You'll have to break your grip and reposition your hand as you're feeding. Now, we have the union of Benjamin Tyler Henry and Oliver Winchester into what would later become the Winchester repeating arms, which would come out with such things like this. Now, their relationship would end in less than favorable fashion, but they would go on to develop Winchester, the 1866 model. Now, the interesting thing about that is you have the incorporation of the King's patent loading gate, which was not, of course, obviously on the 1860 model, so this was a big innovation. That would lead into what we get into this model as the 1873. Now, this would be what a lot of people would call the gun that won the West. This was really the first hugely successful, and still is to today, very, very desirable and collected lever action rifle. In fact, of all the lever action rifles, the 1873 is my personal favorite. Now, this was chambered most popularly in 4440. It was also manufactured in 3220 and 3840. It was never actually chambered in 45 Colt, which, ironically enough, was the standard caliber of the single action army put out by Colt in the same year, 1873. But we have this concept of marrying the cartridges of a rifle and your sidearm where they could both feed the same round. So you have the number 3 large frame, the Schofield Smith & Wesson revolvers, and then again, once the Roland White patent on the bore 3-cylinder would expire, Colt would come out with the 1873 Peacemaker. So, and I'll have some information on that here in a minute and another gun coming up. This would continue in production. You have larger frame variations, the 1886, the 1876. You have the the 94s and the 92s, and of course it all continues to spiral out of control out of there, especially when Browning gets involved and whatnot with the 86 models. Very, very, very cool rifles. Now, what you have specifically here is a Uberti manufactured rifle. Now, Uberti is based out of Italy, and they got their start in the 1950s. Now, after the Second World War, there was a lot of interest in the sort of spaghetti westerns, the shows and the movies that are coming out about the western genre. Huge amount of interest coming out with cowboy-style firearms. What they would do is they would come out with versions of the Colt Single Action Army, the Winchester firearms, and they still manufacture them and sell them today. These are used by and large by enthusiasts, competitive shooters. A lot of their products have been used over the years in Hollywood as well, as they are less expensive, really good facsimiles of the original patterns. Now, Winchester originally only manufactured the 1873 in two main base production variants. You had the sporting rifle, which had a crescent butt plate and a 24-inch barrel, octagonal or round. Or you could get it in the carbine variation, where you had a shotgun-style butt plate with a handguard here affixed with a barrel band up here towards the front end of the handguard. That would have a 20-inch barrel. There was a musket variation as well. Now, Winchester, you could special order the different configurations that you wanted, but those are the two main standard issue or standard production models. This is what Uberti calls the short rifle, which is in the rifle configuration with the crescent butt plate and a full-length handguard with no barrel band, but a 20-inch carbine-length barrel. Again, back in the day, you could have ordered it in this configuration if you wanted to, but it was never really built by Winchester like this in this configuration for a standard production or standard purchase back at the time. So a little bit different, a little bit of an oddball in that regard, but still very, very nice, ergonomic, comfortable, and really, really classic looking firearm with the color case hardened aesthetic on the finish and that sort of thing. So really, really cool. Now, if you're looking at an original Winchester 1873, whether it's the first, second, third model condition and anything like that, they can get very pricey. Quickly, you can top $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 depending on what you're getting. And a lot of people, if you're getting that high in price, don't necessarily want to take them out and shoot a lot of rounds through them. These reproductions, which look great and function almost exactly the same way, there are some safety features and things built into them, but you typically get into something like this for around the $1,000 mark, so not super expensive. Winchester markets a new manufactured variation of their original lines manufactured by Miroku in Japan, which also will run you around $1,000 to $1,300 new. So really, really classic rifles. Love getting these in, and that is a Uberti manufactured Winchester 1873. Okay, up next I have a beautiful revolver that comes to us from a viewer in Florida. So thank you so much for sending this one along to us. This is actually a Beretta manufactured single action army clone known as the Stampede. Now, if we talk about the Colt Single Action Army, it would debut in 1873 after the expiration of the Roland White patent, which then gave Smith & Wesson exclusivity on the concept of the bore-through cylinder. Now, prior to the 1873 Single Action Army from Colt, the popular top break revolvers from Smith & Wesson, the most notable of which was the large frame number 3, later adapted by General Schofield, which is where you get the term the Schofield revolver, which really what he did is he had the idea of changing the latching system from being mounted on the frame to being mounted on top of the barrel assembly, so he could retract the latch and open the barrel one-handed, as any horse rider would definitely want to be able to do, being able to manipulate it with only one hand. Now, after the expiration of that patent, Colt would quickly come out with their own bore-through cylinder design, known as the Peacemaker, which is really the nickname, the 1873 Colt Single Action Army. As the name would dictate, it was a single action revolver. You had a loading gate off here to the right-hand side. You would bring the revolver to half cock. Now, the Beretta only has 2 clicks, half cock and full cock. The Colt would have had the famed 4-click system, but you go to half cock. You would then load all 6 chambers if you want. Actually, the typical loading dictates of the time were to load 1, skip 1, and then load 4, so that after it was loaded and you rested the hammer, it was rested on an empty chamber. You could then go to the firing position, and then you have 5 rounds from there. Being single action, you would have to rack the hammer back between every single shot. Now, when you were empty, again, you would open the loading gate, go to half cock, and you would use the ejecting rod here at the bottom of the revolver in order to eject your spent casings. Very, very revolutionary at the time, even though the number 3 pattern of being a top break Being able to quickly eject all your rounds and get access to the chambers was a lot quicker. The hinge point was definitely known as a weak point of the revolver. And the Colt single action Army was just known for being more reliable, more robust, not prone to any type of jams or stoppages or anything getting in their very, very locked up system. And that's just popularly chambered in the .45 Colt. Although they did make it in a couple other calibers to go along with some of the very popular lever actions. We just talked about the 1873 at the time, like the 3840, the 3220, and so on. Now, modern variations like this are very commonly seen in 357, which is what this is chambered in. Now, Beretta, like a lot of other manufacturers, would come out with their own variation of the single-action Army. Ruger had done very much the same thing. There were some Italian companies like Beretta doing this as well, like Uberti in the 1950s. Now, they would cease production on this. I don't know exactly when. I believe it was around 2013 that Beretta would actually cease production on this, because Beretta did actually purchase Uberti, and Uberti is already making these. So it's probably a little bit redundant to be made by the two different brand names. Now, the difference here between this and the Uberti offerings is this does have a transfer bar safety, so you could load all 6 cylinders and carry with a loaded cylinder without any risk for accidental discharges or anything like that, which was a risk if you did not have a transfer bar and the firing pin mounted to the face of the hammer, which was traditional in the 1873 single-action Army. Now, price point on these, this is a nickel finish with a 4 3/4 inch barrel. Now, the single action Army had the 4 3/4 inch, the 5.5, and the 7.5. The 7.5 being the first variation, but this with the 4 3/4 inch barrel is what we would call sort of the gunfighter variation. Typically, the variation you see in Western films and things like that. These would sell in about the $700 range, respectively, plus or minus, depending on the model. They had a deluxe model, the standard model. They had a short one with the bird's head grip, so they would fluctuate, but they were around that price range. So a little bit pricier than where you would see a Uberti, which is probably also why sales on the Ubertis would cause these to slow down a little bit, and they would bring them out of production. Really, really interesting firearm and really, really nice craftsmanship. Good feeling, very nice tight lock, but nice trigger. So happy to get that in and share it with you guys. That is a Beretta Stampede copy of the Colt Single Action Army. Okay, up next I have a classic revolver that comes to us from a viewer in Washington. So thank you so much for sending this one along to us. This is a Smith & Wesson Model 36 No Dash, also known as the Chief Special, chambered in 38 Special. Now, development for this would begin in the late 1940s after the conclusion of the Second World War, and this product would actually be debuted in 1950. Now, backing up a little bit, if we look at World War II production, a lot of the arms manufacturers, this is true in the United States, is of course around the entire world, but a lot of arms manufacturers are learning the benefits associated with mass production, part standardization, reducing production costs, and putting out a large-scale product into the market. A lot of these production techniques were put into consumer manufacturing of firearms post-World War II, which is where we see a lot of this sort of change in the quantity, the quality of firearms put out if we talk about 1930s versus 1950s. Now, after the commencement of the Second World War, and actually back at home during the 1940s and the war is going on, there is a growing need for a defensive carry or defensive use firearms, as that sort of culture is starting to become very popular, really starting in the 1920s back in the gangster era up through about the 1950s. Now, in the 1920s, Colt would capitalize on this with their release of the Detective Special. It was really meant to be marketed towards police departments, of course, as the name would suggest, but it saw a lot of use and attention in the consumer market as well, mainly for people looking for something to carry as a defensive sidearm. Now, post-World War II, just like every arms manufacturer, Smith & Wesson is looking to come out into the market with a brand new product a little bit different than what they had previously been manufacturing to fill the niche in this type of marketplace. And what they would start developing is this. Prior to the Model 36, they had 32 caliber or 32 based revolvers that did not have frames with the durability to meet with the 38 Special, which at the time was deemed to be a really new, good, innovative, and powerful man stopper to be used in defensive carry options. So a lot of consumers are wanting something in the 38 Special load, so Smith & Wesson would answer with this. Not only did they come out with their first real concealed carry revolver in the 38 Special, this would also be the springboard for the introduction of the J-frame in general, which we still definitely really value today. With things like the 442 and the 637 and the Bodyguard series of revolvers, the J-frame revolver lineup has been a staple in all gun production, really, since its inception here with the Model 36. Now, it does have a 5-round capacity, of course, chambered in 38 Special, and it is double single action. Very, very lightweight, ergonomic, and very, very concealable. Now, the Detective Special did have a 6-round capacity, and it also was a little bit more expensive, so this was a good middle of the road in terms of size, durability, ruggedness, capacity, and cost that really made a splash on the consumer market and has been around really ever since. Now, this did cease production in the 1990s, but was then brought back in 2008 for part of the Classic series with Smith & Wesson. So they still can be purchased today. If you get a Classic 36 no dash, something like this in excellent condition, they are not super expensive, and you should be able to pick one up for about the $500 to $600 mark. So for the money and just for the collectability of them, and they're still very, very practical, usable firearm today, the J-Frame Model 36 Chief Special is a really good option. So really happy to get that in here in this video and share it with you guys, and thank you again to our viewer in Washington. Okay, up next is somewhat of a crowd favorite and a rifle I'm sure many of you recognize. This is an M1 Garand rifle that comes to us from the same viewer who sold us the CZ24. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. Really happy to get these in for this video. The M1 Garand rifle, this one is particularly made by Springfield. Now, there were 4 main manufacturers of these. That would be Springfield, Winchester, IHC, which is International Harvester Corp., and H&R, Harrington and Richardson. Springfield and Winchester made up all of the production of those rifles used in the Second World War. Winchester would cease production in 1945. Now, so would Springfield, but Springfield would continue production again in 1952, which is when H&R and IHC would take up production, and all production would cease in about 1957. Now, these would still go on and continue to be used in the Vietnam War, and they're still used in limited practice today for ceremonial and training purposes. But we would, issue these to the ARVN in the Vietnam War, even though the United States was adopting the M16 and M14 at the time. Now, during the Second World War, of course, this was a revolutionary design. General Patton would say it was the greatest battle implement ever devised, and he wasn't wrong, at least for the technology at the time. And not only that, but military doctrine of putting a semi-automatic rifle in the hands of every infantryman who is tasked with carrying a rifle. This was a new concept at the time, which is really also only being adopted by Russia with the SVT-40. Some other countries are issuing them as ancillary, sort of secondary rifles, specialist rifles, if you would, but the main primary issue rifle being something like this made somewhat of a difference in terms of being able to put out higher volumes of fire. Now, this was fed from an 8-round M-block clip into an internal magazine. Upon the completion of the 8 rounds, the clip would eject out the top, giving the iconic ping noise that everybody likes to associate with these rifles. The inventor was John C. Garand. Technically it's pronounced Garand, but I'm just used to saying Garand like everybody else, so I'm just going to say Garand. Of course, Canadian-born, would come up with this concept. There were different design iterations, starting with a gas trap. They would then go to a simple gas block. But really, the design did not change much from his basic first design concepts of the rifle. Really, really, really interesting and unique design, and a ton of fun to collect and own. The pricing on these is all over the place, okay, and that's going to be a lot. That's going to have a lot to do with the manufacturer. It's going to have a lot to do with the production or the era in which it was produced and parts originality. Of course, World War II production and original firearms are going to bring in more money because there's a lot more World War II era collectors. Winchester and M1 Garands that are all correct are probably going to bring in the most. But of course, it's going to vary. You have the CMP where you can get them in different grades. I think the pricing, I would have to go back and look, but like rat grade, I think starts at like $600 or $700. So you should be able to get a good shooter M1 Garand that's not super collectible for about the $800 to $1,000 range, respectively, depending if you want to go the CMP route. On the private market, they may be just a hair higher. If you get something that's all correct and like a Winchester and something in excellent condition, these can easily scale $2,000 to $3,000 in that sort of configuration. But most of what you see are sort of CMP, been re-arsenaled and things like that. Now, there is no such thing as matching parts on these. You have drawing numbers, which you can get down into the nitty-gritty to determine, about the production time of those. You have barrel dates that could date to see if the receiver and the barrel are likely original to each other. You have early sights like lock bar sights, early op rods. You can really get down into the weeds and trying to determine if it's really a period correct rifle or not. I actually have a very detailed video exactly on this topic, which I will link down below. But anyway, really, really cool rifle. Happy to get this one and to share it with you guys. It is a Springfield manufactured and one Garand rifle. Okay, up next I have a couple Luger pistols, and like many of you, I am a huge fan of these pistols. I own a couple myself. First of all, this one comes to us from a local customer, and this one comes to us from a viewer in Iowa. So thank you so much for selling these to us. Happy to get them in here in the video. Now, the story with this would actually begin with the inventor Georg Luger, who worked for DWM, Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabriken. Sorry for the mispronunciation. I'm not German, in case you guys haven't noticed. And it was really a design iteration off of the Hugo Borchardt design, the C93 Borchardt. Now, that used the toggle lock system, similar to this. But it was very much of an unconventional design. It was a very early sort of design concept of a semi-automatic military pistol. Very large, very unwieldy. The balance was weird. Took a lot of resources and parts to manufacture. But Georg Luger really liked this idea of the strong toggle link system, which coincidentally something very similar to it was used in the 1873 Winchester that we already took a look at. So you have somewhat of a joint here on the top that pulls back and goes forward. So that's sort of like your slide action on the pistol. That was, of course, really designed. That's kind of what made the C93 Borchardt pistol interesting and popular. Now, Georg Luger had taken that concept and scaled it down into something that was much more wieldy. You could carry this easily in a holster. Did not take as much manufacturing, parts and things like that to put together by the standards of the time. Of course, by today's standards, that's not the case. And made it really more of a reliable semi-automatic service pistol. Now, the first variation was the 1900, most notably known as the Swiss Luger. From there, you have the German Navy adopting it in 1906, but that was the pattern 1904 with the longer barrel and sort of a more of a tangent style sight on the rear. And then in 1908, it would be adopted by the German military, which is where it gets the designation P08. Now, originally it would have been chambered in a bottlenecked cartridge, the 30 caliber Luger. German military wanted it to be produced as somewhat of a more potent military round, so he would straighten the casing and come out what was known as the 9mm Luger, or the 9mm Parabellum, meaning for war. So we get out of that, you see 9mm Luger on the casing. That was because it was designed for the Luger pistol. Okay, that might go without saying. Now, during the First World War, it would be the standard issue sidearm for the German military, being produced by two firms, DWM and Erfurt, primarily. Okay, you would have the adoption in 1917 of the artillery Luger with a very, very long barrel, also made for those few years. In the interwar period, you would have a variation of commercial manufactured Lugers, and this would stay as the main primary service German sidearm, or one of them, through the Second World War, being mainly produced by Mauser, which is what this is. So here's World War I, World War II, and there was really no design change made between the two wars. Like you would have the 1911 pistol in World War I in the United States, you'd have the 1911 A1. There were some design iterations. Really here, that was not the case. Now, like I said, Mauser would take up most production. There were other producers of the Luger, most commonly, as I want to say, Krieghoff and things like that, but those are few and far between. Most of them were made by Mauser. Now, they would start up production again in if I can get this right, so it was 1935, and you would call those the K-dated Lugers. Of course, this is before Germany was really allowed to be rearming. 1934 was the K-date, 1935 would be the G-date, and then in 1936, that's when you would start dating the pistols. And production on this would really cease in about 1945 at the conclusion of the war. By then, this is really relegated as old, antiquated technology, and they were really not used or manufactured for service, at least in Germany, anymore after that point in time. Now, in 1938, Germany was already planning on replacing the Luger with the P38 pistol, which was already in service. So they were being manufactured side by side, but the P38 was always regarded as a more viable war implement sidearm. And the Luger was really more, in most cases, ornamental. I mean, it was used as a viable sidearm, but not really as rugged and good for military service as the P38, okay? So as Germany would go on, you would have the P1s and things like that that would go forward. You never see these again. Mainly, they're too expensive by the 1940s. They're too expensive and too complicated to produce and not as reliable as other things. On the market today, they remain being a very, very collectible, probably one of the most collected firearm genres in and of itself are Luger pistols. The variants that exist, the barrel lengths, the different variants even used in Germany, let alone Switzerland or other countries, is extensive. And you could spend a lifetime trying to chase down a full collection showing the different variational changes of the Luger in general over a long production period. Both of these are all matching. However, both of these have been refinished. This one, of course, does not have its original grips on it. So these would be somewhat a little bit more collectible due to their matching numbers, but still I would consider them shooters because they have been refinished. Sorry to get back to pricing. I know I'm dragging this one out a little bit. You're looking at about shooter grade Lugers anywhere from about $700 to $1,000, depending on condition and parts matching. Matching rare variation like Krieghoff Lugers can get way up there. Black Widow, which would be 41 and 42 dated Mausers, which actually that would be the end of Mauser Protection 42 with the Bakelite grips and all black parts. It's really a collector's nomenclature, but those can get up to $2,000, $3,000. So collectible piece, $2,000 plus. A shooter like this, maybe around $1,000 respectively. So anyway, happy to get those in and share them with you guys. Last but definitely not least, I have an interesting rifle that comes to us from a viewer in Illinois. This is a Colt LE901-16S, which is a civilian semi-automatic version of the Colt CM901. Now, this is an AR-10 7.62x51 NATO or 308 as marked on the barrel, which, believe it or not, would actually be Colt's first, and this would come about in about 2010, which is pretty late compared to the other manufacturers that have been making AR-10 pattern ARs for quite a long time. Now, when Colt would get the rights to the AR-15, which would later they would use and become the military M16, they also had the rights to the AR-10 308, but through all this time never really came up with an AR-10 pattern, mainly because there was not deemed to be any type of military application for it. Now, Colt wanting to stay relevant with military contracts, this was especially true around 2009, 2010, when there was a lot happening in the military and with M16 and M4 contracts. Colt would want to come out with something refreshed and new that would get a lot of military and police contract attention. So they would come out with the CM901, the modular carbine system, which is what this is, which is in itself a little bit innovative. What you have, as mentioned, is an AR-10 and 308. But they do have a conversion block system, if you will, that does mount to the front pivot pin area of any standard AR-15 upper, whether it's 5.56, 7.62x39, 300 blackout. And as long as you have that conversion block mounted to the front pivot pin, you could actually drop that upper into this lower. You just do a quick change on the recoil spring and buffer based on the caliber you're shooting, and then you're in a whole new caliber, making this really limitless in terms of the caliber conversion options as long as you have the recoil spring buffer and upper of the caliber that you want. So really, really cool. Of course, this is your serialized part, so you have this. Any other mix of uppers will do. You can have fun at the range with all sorts of different calibers. So that was really the interesting philosophy behind this. Now, the military variation, of course, was select fire, and this was designed to be a select fire. But of course, the semi-automatic variations came out just for removal of the auto sear or anything like that. So it is identical to the military and law enforcement intended 901 rifle, but just semi-automatic only for the commercial market. So really no functional differences, which is what's great about Colt products, is because that's true across all their AR-15s for the most part. So, or at least their LE6920s and things like that. So really cool to get this in. Is not something that I've had a lot of experience seeing. So happy to get this one in handle, and thank you to our viewer. On the used market, these stabilize between about $2,000 to $2,500 depending on condition, original box, and things like that. So they are not cheap, but they are good quality, and of course interesting as being Colt's first 308 AR-10 rifle. So happy to get that in and share it with you guys. Well, that is all the time I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button. Please also consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell notification button so you are aware when I am posting new content. I'm going to leave you guys off with that. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV, and I will see you next time.